My name is Renata Cole, and I am 33 years old. 6 years ago, my mother told me that if I kept the baby, she would consider it the end of any real relationship between us. That a child born under those circumstances was not someone she was prepared to call her grandchild. Last Thursday, she rang my doorbell for the first time in 6 years. My daughter Josie, who is 3, ran to answer it before I could reach the door. She looked up at the woman standing there, holding a small wrapped box, and asked the only question that made sense to her: "Who are you?" I watched my mother's composure break in a way I had genuinely never seen in 33 years of knowing her. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and the time where you are watching from. I read every single one. Let me take you back to the year everything between us changed, and the conversation that started it. I grew up in a household where my mother, Patricia, ran things with a level of precision that, looking back, I think she genuinely believed was love expressed through structure. She had specific expectations about how my life was supposed to unfold: good grades, a respectable college, a stable career, marriage at an appropriate age to an appropriate person, children only once all of those previous boxes had been checked in the correct order. My father, Walter, mostly deferred to her judgment on most matters. The way some marriages settle into a pattern where one person's certainty simply absorbs the other person's opinions over enough years. I was an only child, which meant every expectation my mother held landed entirely on me. With no sibling to dilute or distribute the weight of it, I largely followed the plan for most of my 20s. Good university, a steady job in marketing, a long-term relationship that, while comfortable, never quite felt like something I had chosen so much as something that fit conveniently into the timeline my mother had been describing since I was a teenager. That relationship ended when I was 29, amicably, simply to people who had drifted into compatibility rather than love. Recognizing eventually that comfort was not actually enough to build a life on, I met Daniel Foster 8 months later, at a friend's housewarming party. In circumstances that felt considerably more spontaneous than anything in my carefully structured adult life up to that point. Daniel was a high school science teacher, divorced once already in his late 30s, with a steady, grounded warmth that I had not previously understood I was missing until I encountered it directly. We did not get married. We talked about it genuinely, but neither of us felt a particular urgency about the formality, both of us having watched, in different ways, how a marriage certificate alone had never guaranteed the kind of partnership we actually wanted. I became pregnant roughly a year into our relationship, unplanned, but once the initial shock settled, genuinely wanted by both of us. I told my mother during a Sunday phone call, the way you tell your mother news you hope, somewhere deep down, she will simply be happy about. She was quiet for several seconds after I told her. Then she asked directly whether Daniel and I had any plans to marry before the baby arrived. I told her we did not have specific plans, that we were genuinely happy as we were, that marriage might happen eventually, but was not something either of us felt pressured to rush because of the pregnancy. The silence that followed was different from the first one, longer, heavier. She said, eventually, that she had not raised me to have a child outside of marriage, that this was not the life she had envisioned for me, that people would have certain assumptions about a baby born under, quote, those kinds of circumstances. I told her, the circumstances were that two adults who loved each other and had built a stable life together were having a child together, and that the absence of a marriage certificate did not change any of the actual substance of our relationship. She told me, in the calm, measured voice she used for decisions she had already finalized, that if I went through with having this baby outside of marriage, she would not be able to consider herself a grandmother to it in any meaningful sense. I want to be honest about how genuinely shocked I was by that statement, even though, looking back across my entire childhood, I probably should have anticipated some version of this reaction. I asked her, directly, if she understood what she was actually saying, that she was describing her own future grandchild as someone she was not prepared to claim as family because of a technicality involving paperwork rather than anything about the child themselves. She said it was not a technicality, that it represented a fundamental difference in values, that she had spent her entire life building a particular kind of respectability for our family, and that a grandchild born outside of marriage represented, in her words, a step backward from everything she had worked to establish. My father got on the phone briefly during this conversation, his voice quiet, uncertain. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years deferring to his wife's certainty and was not about to start questioning it now. Even regarding his own future grandchild, he said only that he hoped, eventually, things would settle. The kind of statement that commits to nothing while sounding vaguely supportive. Daniel and I did not marry before Josie was born. We discussed it, honestly, in the weeks following that conversation with my mother, and concluded deliberately that we were not willing to let her ultimatum dictate decisions about our own relationship and our own family. I sent my mother an ultrasound photo 2 months later. The kind of small olive branch you extend when some part of you still hopes the initial reaction might soften with time and distance from the shock of the original announcement. She did not respond to the photo at all, not a phone call, not a text, nothing. I sent a birth announcement when Josie arrived. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, Daniel's steady gray eyes. My own dark, curly hair, that too, received no response whatsoever. My father called once, quietly, about 3 weeks after Josie was born. His voice, careful in the way it had been during that original phone call. He asked how the baby was doing. He did not ask to see her. He mentioned briefly that my mother was, quote, still processing everything, before ending the call relatively quickly. For the first 2 years of Josie's life, the silence from my mother remained almost entirely complete. I sent occasional photos, mostly out of habit rather than expectation. The way you continue a ritual even after you have largely stopped believing it will produce any different result than it always has. My father maintained slightly more contact. Brief phone calls every few months, always careful, always somewhat guarded. The conversations of someone navigating a marriage where one person's position had calcified into something that felt, from the outside, almost impossible to challenge directly. I built, during these years, an entirely different kind of family structure around Josie. Daniel's parents, both warm, unconditionally affectionate people, became the primary grandparent figures in her life. His mother, Carol, visited monthly, sometimes more, bringing small gifts, teaching Josie songs, building the kind of steady, reliable presence that my own mother had explicitly refused to provide. I want to be clear that I did not spend these years nursing some elaborate resentment or building toward eventual confrontation. I was simply living my life, raising my daughter, allowing the relationship with my mother to exist in whatever diminished form it had settled into. Without expecting it to change, Josie began noticing, around age 2.5, the way children eventually notice everything. That other kids at her daycare had grandmothers who picked them up sometimes, who showed up for small classroom celebrations, who existed as a regular, expected presence in their lives. She asked me once, watching another child get picked up by an older woman who was clearly delighted to see her, why she did not have a grandma like that. I told her she had Grandma Carol, Daniel's mother, who loved her enormously. She said, with the simple, devastating directness that small children sometimes manage without any awareness of the weight behind their words, but you have a mommy. Doesn't your mommy have a mommy too? I did not have a particularly good answer for that question. I still do not have a fully satisfying one. Even now, the call came in early spring, almost exactly 6 years after that original Sunday phone call. It was my father. His voice noticeably older, more tentative than I remembered. He told me my mother had been thinking, considerably, about everything over the recent months, that something had shifted in her perspective. Though he was not entirely specific about what had caused the shift, he asked, carefully, if she might be permitted to visit. Just once, just to see Josie, to begin, perhaps, some version of a relationship that had never actually started. I asked him directly whether my mother had ever, in 6 years, acknowledged that her original position had been wrong, or unreasonable, or worth reconsidering on its own merits. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think she's trying, Renata. I think that has to count for something at this point. I told him I needed to think about it, and that whatever happened next would need to happen entirely on terms that protected Josie first, regardless of what my mother had or had not resolved internally. I talked through the decision extensively with Daniel that evening, the way we discussed every significant choice in our life together. He told me it was entirely my decision, that he would support whatever I chose. But he also said something that stayed with me through the following days. He said, I'm less worried about whether she visits once. I'm more worried about what it teaches Josie. If someone gets to simply walk back into her life without anything actually being acknowledged or changed. I thought about that for several days before calling my father back. I told him my mother could visit once, on a specific afternoon, at our house, with both Daniel and myself present throughout. I told him this was not automatically a reconciliation. It was an opportunity for her to see directly what 6 years of her own choice had actually cost, and to decide based on that what she genuinely wanted moving forward. The Thursday arrived in early April. I spent the morning unable to settle into any task fully, cleaning surfaces that did not need cleaning, checking the time more often than the actual schedule required. Daniel stayed close throughout the morning, not saying much, simply present in the steady way he always was when he sensed I needed someone nearby without needing to ask directly for it. 82 in the afternoon. A car pulled into our driveway that I recognized immediately. Despite the years that had passed, my mother stepped out slowly, holding a small wrapped box, dressed with the same careful precision I remembered from childhood. Though she looked, unmistakably, older than 6 years should have made her, more gray in her hair, a slight uncertainty to her posture that had simply never existed in the mother I grew up with. She stood on the front walkway for a long moment before approaching the door. The way someone hesitates before entering a space they are no longer certain they belong in. Josie, who had been playing near the entryway, heard footsteps on the porch and reached the door before I could intercept her. I will remember the next several seconds for the rest of my life. Josie pulled the door open. She looked up at the unfamiliar woman standing there, this slightly older, formally dressed stranger holding a small wrapped box, and processed the situation the way 3-year-olds process everything directly, without any social performance. Softening the question underneath, she asked, simply, "Who are you?" Not unkindly, not with any particular emotional weight attached to it from her end. Simply a genuine, curious question from a child encountering an unfamiliar adult at her own front door. I watched my mother's face in that exact moment, and I witnessed something I had genuinely never seen in 33 years of knowing her. The careful composure she had maintained through every difficult conversation of my entire childhood simply collapsed. All at once, replaced by something raw and entirely unguarded. She knelt down slowly, her hand reaching toward the doorframe as though she needed something solid to steady herself against. And she did not answer the question immediately, because I do not think she had, in that moment, any composed answer prepared for it. I stepped forward and stood behind Josie, my hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "This is my mother," I told her evenly. "Your grandma Patricia." Josie looked between the two of us, absorbing this new information with the quick, uncomplicated acceptance that children typically extend to information that does not yet carry any particular emotional history for them. Then she said, simply, "Oh," and held up the small toy she had been carrying, a stuffed rabbit, offering it forward the way young children often do when meeting someone new, sharing the most significant object currently in their possession. My mother looked at the rabbit for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "That's a lovely rabbit," in a voice that was noticeably unsteady. Josie, satisfied with this response, ran back into the house to retrieve additional toys to show off. Entirely unaware of the weight in the room she had just left behind her, we sat in the living room. Daniel made coffee for everyone, the same way he made coffee for any guest, extending the same ordinary hospitality, without any particular message embedded in the gesture itself. My mother held her cup without drinking from it for several minutes, watching Josie, who had returned with an armful of toys to display, entirely oblivious to the significance of the moment surrounding her. My mother said, eventually, her voice still not entirely steady, "She's beautiful, Renata." I told her she was. "She has Daniel's eyes," my mother observed. I did not respond immediately to that. I let the silence sit, the way I had let so many silences sit across the preceding 6 years. "She also has my stubbornness, apparently," I said finally. "That part seems to come through regardless of circumstances." My mother's eyes filled, finally, with tears that had clearly been held back through considerable effort. She said, "I missed everything. Her birth, her first steps. I don't even know when she started talking, or what her favorite foods are, or any of the small things a grandmother is supposed to simply know." I said, "You missed it because you decided, 6 years ago, That a child born without a marriage certificate did not warrant your involvement. I did not say it cruelly. I said it because it was simply factually accurate. And 6 years of careful distance had taught me that stating the truth plainly mattered considerably more than softening it for her comfort. She asked, quietly, if it was too late to begin something different now. I told her I genuinely did not know. That the answer depended entirely on what she actually did moving forward. Not on what she said during this single visit, but on whether she showed up, consistently. The way Carol had shown up every month for 3 years without ever once needing to be asked twice. I told her Josie did not need an apology specifically. Josie needed a grandmother who appeared reliably, without conditions attached, in the same steady way every single time. She left a little over an hour later. Daniel walked her to her car. I do not know precisely what was said between them on the porch, but I watched through the window as my mother paused beside her car for a long moment afterward, looking back toward the house. That evening, once Josie was asleep, Daniel and I sat together on the back porch, talking quietly about the afternoon. He asked how I felt about everything. I told him I felt strange, not vindicated exactly, simply strange. The particular sensation of watching a long-anticipated reckoning finally arrive and discovering it felt considerably quieter than I had expected it to feel. He asked whether I thought she would actually follow through with consistent effort going forward. I told him I genuinely did not know, and that it mattered less than it once would have, because Josie already had a steady, reliable grandmother in Carol, someone who had never once required convincing to show up. Whatever my own mother decided to contribute now would simply be additional. Welcome, certainly, if it actually materialized consistently, but no longer something Josie's sense of family fundamentally depended on. It has been 3 months since that Thursday afternoon. My mother calls now, roughly every 2 weeks, conversations that remain somewhat careful. Both of us still navigating boundaries that have never previously existed between us in this particular configuration. She has visited twice more, both times calling ahead first. Both times bringing something small and age-appropriate. Both times respecting whatever specific boundaries I set, without arguing against them. She has not, in 3 months, used the language she used 6 years ago. Circumstances, respectability, step backward. She has also not, even once, offered a direct, unqualified apology using the actual words "I was wrong." I am not entirely certain she is capable of that particular kind of direct accountability. Even now, even having witnessed firsthand the actual cost of her original position, but she shows up, consistently, without needing to be asked a second time. For now, I am choosing to let that be sufficient, while watching carefully, the way I watch most things now. Without assuming any particular outcome in advance, Josie still does not fully understand why Grandma Patricia was not always simply present, the way Grandma Carol has always been. She is 3. She exists almost entirely within the present moment, largely untroubled by history. She lacks the context to fully process yet. Someday, she will likely ask harder questions. She will ask why there are 6 years of birthdays with no cards. 6 years of milestones that happened without any acknowledgement whatsoever. When that day arrives, I intend to tell her the truth plainly. The way I have gradually learned to discuss all of this honestly, rather than softening it for anyone's comfort, including my own. I will tell her that some people require directly witnessing the actual cost of a decision before they can fully comprehend what they very nearly lost permanently. I will tell her that her grandmother spent 6 years deciding what kind of family she genuinely wanted, and only began reconsidering that decision after encountering, in a handful of unbearable seconds on a front porch, the precise weight of what that choice had actually cost her, embodied entirely in a 3-year-old asking a simple, devastating question. I hope, by the time Josie is old enough to ask, the honest answer will simply be that her grandmother has, by then, been steadily present for years. I do not yet know whether that will turn out to be the story we ultimately tell, but for the first time in 6 years, it has genuinely become a possible one. That is where things currently stand. If you have ever watched someone finally understand the actual cost of a decision, only once, witnessing it had become nearly unavoidable, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. And if this story reminded you that showing up consistently matters considerably more than any single apology ever could, Share it with someone who needs to hear that today. I will see you in the next one.